Picture this. It's the spring of 1823, and the Missouri River is carrying Hugh Glass toward what might be the most important injury in American frontier history. Now, I say that knowing how absurd it sounds, but stick with me here, because this Pennsylvania-born sailor was about to revolutionize how humans dealt with the most dangerous predator on the North American continent. Glass had already lived enough lives for 3 men by the time he was 40. Captured by pirates off the Gulf Coast. Can you imagine? Then escaping by swimming to Texas shores like some kind of maritime Houdini. But here's the part that really matters to our story. He spent 2 winters with the Pawnee tribe, learning their ancient bear songs. And I want you to think about that for a moment. While most white men of that era saw Native Americans as obstacles to progress, Glass was absorbing knowledge that would literally save his life and change everything. He joined William Ashley's fur expedition heading into country where, and this is not an exaggeration, grizzly bears killed 1 out of every 3 mountain men. Let me put that in perspective for you. That's like saying if you and 2 buddies decided to become NFL players, one of you would die just from playing the game. These weren't the relatively docile black bears of the eastern forests that early settlers knew. Rocky Mountain grizzlies were, and I'm using contemporary measurements here, 9 feet tall when they reared up, 800 pounds of muscle and fury, with claws like curved daggers that could split a man's skull like a ripe melon. The Lakota had a name for them, Mutto, the beast that walks like a man. Think about the poetry in that description. It captures something essential about what made these bears so terrifying. They could think, they could plan, they could remember. French voyageurs, those tough-as-nails fur traders who feared almost nothing, whispered about les terribles, bears that could smell fear itself. And you know what? They probably weren't wrong about that last part. Traditional trapping methods were failing spectacularly against these creatures. Steel jaw traps, and we're talking about devices that cost $25 each, which in 1823 money was serious cash. These traps were useless against animals that bent iron like you or I might bend a paperclip. Picture this scene that played out dozens of times across the Rockies. Trappers would spend their life savings on these English-made steel traps, set them according to European techniques perfected on much smaller game, then wake up to find their trap lines scattered across miles of terrain by bears that seemed to view the whole operation as some kind of elaborate joke. But it gets worse. These bears didn't just destroy equipment, they often tracked the trappers who had dared to disturb their territory. Imagine going to sleep knowing that somewhere out there, an 800-pound predator with the intelligence of a large dog and the memory of an elephant might be following your scent trail back to camp. That August, near the forks of the Grand River, Hugh Glass got his education in grizzly bear reality. A female with 2 cubs transformed him from skeptic to believer in the most brutal way possible. She shattered his back, exposed his ribs to the mountain air, and tore his throat so badly that his breath whistled through the wounds like wind through a broken flute. His fellow trappers, including young Jim Bridger, who would later become famous in his own right, waited 2 days for Glass to die. When he didn't have the courtesy to expire on schedule, they took his rifle and knife and left him for the wolves. What happened next is the stuff of campfire legend. Glass crawled 200 miles across some of the most hostile territory on Earth. 6 weeks of dragging himself across rocks and through streams, surviving on roots, berries, and at one point, a rotting buffalo calf so putrid it was crawling with maggots. But here's what most people miss about this story. It wasn't just an incredible feat of human endurance. Those 6 weeks alone gave Glass time to think. Not about revenge, though that's what the legends focus on. No, Glass was thinking about the bear that nearly killed him, and more importantly, why 60 years of European trapping methods had failed so completely against American grizzlies. You see, while his body was healing, his mind was working. He was remembering those Pawnee bear songs, recalling observations about grizzly behavior that most white trappers dismissed as primitive superstition. Glass was starting to understand something that would seem obvious in hindsight, but was revolutionary at the time. You don't fight a grizzly's strengths, you use its intelligence against it. By the time Glass walked into Fort Kiowa that October, looking like death warmed over but walking nonetheless, He had formulated an idea that would make him rich, famous, and ultimately change the entire trajectory of human-bear conflict in North America. The method he was about to propose would sound like madness to men who had invested their life savings in imported steel, but Glass had something they didn't. He had been inside a grizzly's mind, metaphorically speaking, for 6 weeks of crawling contemplation, and what he discovered there would turn the entire trapping industry upside down. When Hugh Glass walked into Fort Kiowa that October, he looked like a ghost, but he spoke like a prophet, and what he was preaching seemed like absolute madness to veterans who had spent small fortunes on imported steel traps that now lay twisted and useless across hundreds of miles of Rocky Mountain wilderness. Glass's method, born from Pawnee wisdom and perfected through the kind of pain that strips away everything except essential truth, violated every principle these men had learned about trapping. Instead of fighting the aced bear's incredible strength, Glass proposed using their intelligence against them. Think about how radical this was. In an era when most people viewed animals as simple, instinct-driven creatures, Glass was suggesting that grizzlies could be outsmarted rather than overpowered. The technique he described required a patience that absolutely frustrated men accustomed to quick profits and even quicker exits from bear country. Listen to this process. First, you locate a buffalo carcass, or create one by taking down a lone bull. Already dangerous work. But here's where it gets interesting. You don't touch that carcass for exactly 13 days. 13. Glass claimed the smell had to reach what he called bear perfection, that sweet spot where the scent was powerful enough to draw grizzlies from miles away, but not so rotten that it would make them suspicious. Next, you position this aromatic masterpiece in what Glass called a natural bottleneck. Picture the landscape. You want that carcass somewhere between a cliff and a river, or where ancient game trails narrowed between massive boulders. Places where a bear's natural caution would be slightly reduced because the terrain itself provided security. Grizzlies, Glass explained, were more comfortable feeding in spots where they couldn't be approached from all directions simultaneously. Above this carefully chosen feeding spot, you construct what Glass termed a widowmaker, a deadfall trap using logs that weighed at least 400 pounds, not 350, not 420, exactly 400 pounds minimum. The logs had to be balanced at precisely 37 degrees, triggered by a system of branches and sinew so cleverly hidden it would be invisible from below. Glass had calculated that angle through brutal trial and error during his crawling weeks, observing how bears moved, how they investigated threats, how they positioned themselves when feeding. But here's the magic, and this is where Glass's understanding of bear psychology separated him from every other trapper in the mountains. The placement had to be exactly 17 feet from the carcass. Not 15, not 20, 17 feet. This was the distance where a feeding bear would naturally back up to defend its prize from potential competitors. Glass had observed that grizzlies, when claiming a major food source, would establish a defensive perimeter at this exact distance. It was instinctive behavior, and Glass was going to exploit it. The details he insisted upon would have made a Swiss clockmaker proud. Approach the site only from downwind, obvious enough. Build during the new moon for maximum darkness, sensible. But then Glass got specific in ways that made hardened mountain men shake their heads. Use pine pitch to mask human scent on every single surface that might be touched. Not just the trigger mechanism, but every log, every branch, every piece of sinew. The bears, he claimed, would investigate anything that carried the faintest trace of human presence. Veterans laughed when Glass demonstrated his method using sketches drawn in the dirt with a charred stick. Especially his claim that bears would investigate traps set at normal height, about 5 to 6 feet off the ground, but would completely ignore threats placed above their natural sightline. Bears, Glass would say, drawing careful diagrams, look for danger at bear height, put your trap above 7 feet, and you might as well be invisible. Jedediah Smith, the Bible-reading brigade leader known for his cautious intelligence, called Glass's method woodland witchcraft. Jake Hawken, the famous gunsmith whose rifles were trusted throughout the mountains, declared that Glass had been brain-addled by his crawling time. These weren't ignorant men, They were experienced professionals who had survived in country that killed most newcomers within a year, but they couldn't accept that their expensive, time-tested methods were fundamentally flawed. However, Pierre Charbonneau, a French-Canadian trapper nursing 3 fingers lost to a grizzly the previous spring, decided to try the crazy man's way. Maybe it was desperation, maybe curiosity, but that November, Charbonneau followed Glass's instructions to the letter. Using 1 dead mule and pine logs that cost him nothing but sweat and patience, he caught a massive silver-tipped male that would have destroyed $1,000 worth of steel traps without breaking stride. The pelt alone fetched $90 in St. Louis, more than most trappers made in a good season. But more importantly, Charbonneau had taken this bear without losing a single finger, toe, or drop of blood. Word of his success spread through the winter camps like flame through dry grass. By spring of 1824, the mountain men were choosing sides in what became known as the Method War. On one side stood the traditionalists, still investing in expensive English steel, still losing men and equipment to bears that seemed to view their efforts with contempt. On the other side gathered Glass's disciples, men willing to trade their steel traps for patient observation and carefully balanced logs. The battle lines were drawn, and the Grizzlies would be the ultimate judges of which approach would survive in the unforgiving mathematics of the Rocky Mountain wilderness. The trapping season of 1825 proved Hugh Glass right with the kind of brutal efficiency that only the wilderness can deliver. And when I say brutal, I mean the numbers were so stark, so undeniable, that even the most stubborn traditionalists had to face reality. Tom "Bear Killer" Jackson. And yes, that was his actual nickname, earned through years of successful grizzly hunting, had invested $800 in the finest English steel traps money could buy. $800. To put that in perspective, that was enough money to buy a small farm back east, or support a family for 2 years. Jackson caught 12 grizzlies that season, which sounds impressive until you hear the rest of the story. He lost 7 men in the process, 7 human beings, each with families, dreams, and futures that ended in screaming agony somewhere in the Rocky Mountain wilderness. Meanwhile, the Glass Brigade, 22 converts who had embraced what everyone else called the madman's method, took 43 grizzlies without losing a single man. Not one. Let me repeat that because it's so important. 43 of the most dangerous predators on the continent, captured using nothing more expensive than dead buffalo, pine logs, and patience, with 0 human casualties. The difference wasn't luck, it was understanding. Traditional trappers were still fighting bears where these creatures were strongest, in direct confrontation, using tools the bears could see, smell, and ultimately destroy. Glass's method caught grizzlies in moments of natural vulnerability, exploiting behavior patterns that had been hardwired into their species for thousands of years. The American Fur Company, watching their profits hemorrhage along with their workforce, sent factor Kenneth Mackenzie to investigate what the hell was happening in the mountains. Mackenzie was no fool. He was a hard-headed businessman who had built a trading empire through careful calculation, not sentiment. What he found fundamentally changed how his company approached the grizzly problem. He discovered Glass teaching classes by firelight, using charcoal on strips of bark to diagram wind patterns that most trappers had never even considered. Glass was showing men how to read the bare highways worn into mountainsides by generations of grizzly passage, trails invisible to European eyes but obvious once you knew what to look for. He explained why bears investigated anything at human head height but ignored threats positioned above 7 feet, demonstrating with sticks and stones how a grizzly's sight lines worked. But here's what really separated Glass from every other expert in the mountains. He was teaching trappers to think like bears. Not just to trap them, but to understand them. This wasn't just revolutionary trapping technique. It was applied naturalism decades before anyone had invented that term. Glass would spend hours explaining grizzly family structures, how a mother bear with cubs behaved differently than a solitary male, how bears approaching salmon runs moved with different patterns than bears seeking winter den sites, how the massive boars that could weigh over 800 pounds had completely different territorial instincts than the smaller females, who were often more aggressive because they were protecting young. This transformation in thinking showed up in the trappers' journals, And this is where the story gets really fascinating. Where mountain men had once written only about fear and killing, they began recording bear behavior with almost scientific detail. Jim Beckwourth, the famous mixed-race mountain man, noted how grizzly mothers taught their cubs to avoid certain areas, not through punishment, but through demonstration and body language. Osborne Russell, who would later write one of the definitive accounts of mountain life, described bears' fishing techniques at salmon runs with the precision of a naturalist. Even young Kit Carson, initially skeptical of Glass's methods, began watching bears for hours before setting a single trap. His journal entries from this period read like field research. Observed large male, estimated 700 pounds, marking territory by clawing bark at precisely 8 feet height on pine trees. Avoided areas with human scent for distance of half-mile. Feeding pattern suggests afternoon approach to water source. Think about what this means. These weren't educated naturalists or university-trained scientists. These were rough frontiersmen who had learned to read sign the way city folks read newspapers. And Glass had turned them into amateur bear biologists without them even realizing it. By 1827, the method had spread from the Yellowstone Basin all the way down to the Colorado peaks. Trading posts began reporting grizzly pelt harvests that defied everything they thought they knew about bear populations. Fort Union alone processed 300 grizzly pelts in 1828, worth nearly $30,000, which was an absolutely staggering sum for that era. But success in the wilderness always comes with a price, and that price isn't always measured in money. Glass's method was working too well. Where traditional steel traps had failed to make a significant dent in grizzly populations because they were so inefficient and costly in human lives, the new techniques were proving devastatingly effective. Mountain men using Glass's approach could take bears safely, consistently, and profitably. The bottleneck wasn't human casualties anymore. It was finding enough bears to trap. In areas where grizzlies had roamed unchallenged for millennia, their numbers were beginning to drop noticeably. The Crow and Blackfoot tribes, who had lived alongside these bears for generations, began commenting on the absence of familiar grizzly families from traditional feeding grounds. Kenneth Mackenzie, writing to American Fur Company headquarters, noted with business-like satisfaction that the Glass method has solved our grizzly problem. But he also added a prophetic observation. At current harvest rates, we may face scarcity issues within a generation. The revolution was complete, but like all revolutions, it had unleashed forces that would prove impossible to control. Glass had given humanity the tools to finally win the age-old war against the great bears of the Rockies. The question was, what would happen when we actually won? Hugh Glass never lived to see his method's full impact. In the winter of 1833, Arikara, warriors killed him on the Yellowstone River. The man who had survived grizzlies, pirates, and a 200-mile crawl fell to human arrows. There's bitter irony in that, isn't there? The wilderness that had tried to kill him for decades was finally conquered not by bears or starvation, but by the same species that had created his revolutionary method. But Glass's revolution outlived him in ways both triumphant and tragic, and the scale of what followed would have horrified the man who started it all. By 1840, mountain men using Glass's method had reduced Rocky Mountain grizzly populations by 60%. 60%. Think about that number for a moment. In less than 2 decades, a species that had ruled these mountains since the last ice age was suddenly facing extinction in vast areas where they had roamed unchallenged for millennia. The method that had begun as one man's desperate attempt to survive had become a machine of unprecedented efficiency. Then came the California gold rush of 1849, and suddenly thousands more fortune seekers were pouring into bear country armed with Glass's knowledge. Every mining camp, every trading post, every settlement that sprang up like mushrooms after rain, they all had men who knew the 17-foot rule, the 37-degree angle, the 13-day wait for bear perfection. What had once been specialized knowledge, shared among a few dozen mountain men, was now common currency among thousands of would-be prospectors. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. Within 50 years of Glass's crawl, grizzlies had vanished from 90% of their historic range. The bears that had once numbered an estimated 50,000 across the Western Territories dwindled to fewer than 1,000 survivors, clinging to existence in the most remote corners of the northern Rockies. Entire ecosystems that had evolved around the presence of these massive omnivores began to collapse as the apex predators disappeared. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, because Glass's true legacy wasn't destruction, it was understanding. And that understanding survived in the most unlikely place, his notebooks. When trader Daniel Potts sent Glass's journals to his sister in Philadelphia for safekeeping, he was just trying to preserve the belongings of a dead friend. He had no idea he was saving what wildlife biologist Frank Craighead would later call the first scientific study of grizzly behavior hidden in a trapper's diary. These journals, rediscovered in 1912 gathering dust in a Philadelphia attic, revealed observations that anticipated modern bear biology by more than a century. Glass had documented how grizzlies used specific plants for healing, particular roots for digestive problems, certain bark for wound treatment. He had mapped their complex social hierarchies, noting how dominant males established territories not through constant fighting, but through elaborate scent-marking protocols that avoided deadly confrontations. Most remarkably, he had observed how bear families passed knowledge through generations, with mothers teaching cubs not just what to eat, but where to find it, when to find it, and how to avoid human contact. Reading Glass's journals today is like discovering that someone had secretly been conducting PhD-level research while everyone thought he was just trying to make a living. His notes on bear denning behavior wouldn't be matched by academic science until the 1970s. His observations about grizzly salmon fishing techniques precisely describe behaviors that researchers are still studying today. Modern bear conservation uses principles that Glass discovered through necessity. When park rangers establish safe camping distances in Yellowstone and Glacier, they're essentially applying Glass's 17-foot rule, the understanding that bears maintain predictable defensive perimeters around food sources. Wildlife corridors that allow bear populations to move safely between protected areas follow routes that Glass mapped as ancient bear highways, worn into the landscape by countless generations. Even those precise calculations that seemed so mysterious to his contemporaries appear in modern conservation work. The 37-degree angle shows up in humane trap designs. The 13-day timing relates to scent dispersal patterns that wildlife biologists use to predict bear behavior around carcasses. Glass wasn't just lucky or intuitive, he was observing and quantifying natural patterns that science wouldn't formally recognize for another century. But perhaps the most profound part of Glass's legacy is philosophical. The mountain man, dismissed as crazy for suggesting that humans could think like bears, proved that understanding trumps domination every single time. Traditional trappers had tried to impose European methods on American wildlife and failed catastrophically. Glass succeeded by learning to work with bear nature rather than against it. Today, as grizzly bears slowly reclaim small portions of their historic ranges under careful scientific management, biologists study those 300-year-old Pawnee bear songs that Glass transcribed during his winter stays with the tribe. And here's the remarkable thing. Those songs contain encoded information about seasonal bear behavior, denning patterns, and territorial movements that Western science has only recently confirmed through radio collar studies and DNA analysis. The ridiculous method that began with one man's desperation to survive a grizzly attack became the foundation for everything we know about human-bear coexistence. Glass proved that sometimes the most important survival skill isn't a bigger weapon or stronger armor. It's the wisdom to understand your place in a larger system and work within it rather than against it. The man who crawled 200 miles to survive gave us something more valuable than any individual life. He gave us a way to think about our relationship with the natural world that acknowledges both its dangers and its profound intelligence. In the end, that may be the most revolutionary idea of all. And that, my friends, is how one mountain man's ridiculous method changed everything we thought we knew about sharing the world with bears.